So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's joint webinar between ISACA New England and Wolf & Company PC, titled Whatever Happened Last Time, It Wasn't a Penetration Test. This webinar is worth 1 CP. In order to ensure timely and accurate crediting of CPs, please ensure your full name is set as your display name in Zoom. If your full name isn't there, you can do so by hovering over your video box, clicking over the 3-dot ellipsis and clicking rename is one option. Otherwise, I may ping your folks individually through the chat just to confirm your full and/or last name so that you're able to get credit for those valuable and coveted CPEs. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please do submit those questions via the Q&A button so that we can answer the questions either throughout the presentation, where I'll pause Matt, or during our allocated time at the end of the presentation. We've also opened up the chat functionality should you folks wish to share thoughts or dialogue or feedback amongst yourselves, as in previous sessions, participants found it helpful to have a dialogue as the presentation and material evolves. We will aim to end this presentation by around 12:50 or so and allow about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Like I said, if there's any organic breaks throughout the presentation, we can have Matt answer the questions that come through. I'll be keeping track of those, but we will save time at the end for you folks to answer any and all questions you have of Matt. A recording of this meeting will be made available on Wolf & Company's YouTube page for future reference, with the link shared once uploaded, and the PowerPoint deck that Matt has will be shared as well shortly after the meeting ends and along with that YouTube link. Lastly, I'll send through a survey in the chat near the end for ISACA to collect feedback so that we can improve these webinars in the future. So with that, I want to introduce Matt Burns, no relation, by the way, but Matt's a colleague of mine and a penetration tester in Wolf's IT Assurances Group, recently rebranded as DenSecure, where he's responsible for coordinating and conducting penetration testing services for our clients in a variety of industries, including financial institutions, healthcare, and software. His expertise consists of both internal and external penetration testing, social engineering, threat emulation exercises, vulnerability assessments, cloud security assessments, and Active Directory security reviews. Additionally, Matt has experience with standards from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, the Center of Internet Security, CIS, and leveraging the MITRE adversarial tactics, techniques, and common attack framework. Matt has over 4 years experience performing security assessments and is working on a certification from industry recognized organizations such as Offensive Security. So without further ado, Matt, I turn things over to you.
Thanks, Todd, for that wonderful intro. And thank you, everybody, for taking the time to come to my talk. Whatever happened last time, it wasn't a penetration test. So just for, as Todd was saying, my name is Mathew Burns. I'm a penetration tester at Wolf & Co. And there's my information for anybody who wants to contact me or get in touch after this talk. Here's some quick information about Wolf & Company. If you don't know about us, we're a CPA firm that's been in business for about 111 years. But what I'm more interested in is the DenSecure side, and this is the part I'm a part of. That, as Todd was saying, this is kind of our group in the IT assurance that does all of our DenSecure, that does all of the security testing, including social engineering, threat emulation, penetration testing, anything like that. We can provide it for you. So yeah, we are all part of Wolf & Company. So, we're all full-time employees here working as part of the IT assurance group. So what are we here to talk about? Specifically, apologies. Box popped up. What are we here to talk about? We're specifically here to talk about penetration testing, and the fact that it's there's a lack of understanding there. The fact that getting it wrong has a bunch of consequences. Getting a bad penetration test can easily lead to a breach. And then there are vendors selling these services that don't actually perform them. For example, folks sometimes will say they're performing a penetration test, when in reality all they're doing is running a vulnerability scan for you and giving you the output, which is not a penetration test. And lastly, it annoys me that this is going on, that there's just a little bit of misunderstanding about what actually a penetration test is, and what kind of the deliverables will be for it. So what does this tend to lead to from a client who doesn't really understand penetration testing when we come in as a first-time client, as a first-time vendor there? A lot of the times we get questions like, but we let you in. That's not a realistic scenario. Our MSSP would have stopped you, or a managed service provider. The report does not adequately reflect our environment. Then we're tracking that issue, which we'll touch on later. Our report was clean last year, or why didn't the previous vendor find this, which is always a tough question to get, and it's really hard to answer. So I wanted to paint a scenario for you folks. So let's talk about company A here. So company A, regulators require an annual penetration test. The issue is the bigwigs, or the C-level suite at the company, don't really understand security, so they provide a limited budget for a penetration test to their security team. The security team in the company, go looking for a vendor that fits their small budget. And surprisingly, there's a lot of security companies that will do cheap penetration testing. For example, I'm sure if you go on Google right now, you can search penetration testing vendors, and you can find a lot of them that will say, oh, we will do a penetration test for you for $100 or $99 penetration test, good tagline, but I can promise you, you're not getting a real penetration test for that type of money. And so that company has to pick one of those options because of their very limited budget. So they pick one that's close to the cheapest, but not the cheapest, just so they can say they did a little bit of work there. So what happens at that point? Well, as you probably could have guessed, it turns into a little bit of a dumpster fire. So once the penetration test finishes, here's kind of what the report looks like and why it's a bit of a dumpster fire. There's two options. Option A, there's no or very few findings with little to no impact. This could be bad because obviously it can give a false sense of security there to the organization that purchased the penetration test if they got it from a cheap vendor there. And then option B is kind of what we talked about earlier, where there is just a massive spreadsheet of vulnerabilities that weren't really tested for, actual exploitation or validity there to see if they actually matter in the environment. That's kind of the case where you can run you do get a penetration test, but it's just kind of a vulnerability scan disguised as a penetration test. So now company A has a bit of a problem here because in either of these scenarios, they have some issues that can arise. The first issue here, as I talked about, there's a false sense of security that can arise if they get a port with little or no findings, but it wasn't like a real penetration test. The second issue is that there could be a bunch of new job openings because the IT department, was slammed with this massive spreadsheet of vulnerabilities, and there's a bunch of issues they need to somehow fix by the end of the next audit year, or maybe even the next audit year, just because of how big of a spreadsheet they were provided in terms of vulnerabilities and issues there. So that's a lot of issues that can happen if you go with kind of a cheap vendor and one that's not really providing you with a full penetration test. So let's say this happens again and you just decide to go with another cheap vendor. What's going to happen again? Sorry, to go back a little bit. So why does this kind of happen? So as we kind of talked about, there's lack of buy-in from the top, which leads to a lack of budget for the vendor, which leads to a crappy vendor, which leads to poor work or false positives, or even worse, false negatives, as we kind of talked about. Those clean reports can kind of lead to issues there if the work wasn't done appropriately. A false sense of security and a massive pile of work, which we kind of already touched on. And eventually a breach could happen from any of these issues if one wasn't found, or you just have so many vulnerabilities in a spreadsheet that you can't address the ones that actually matter. So that's what could happen when you go with a poor security testing company, one that's not really providing you with a full penetration test. So surely this won't happen again, right? Company A is like, all right, we'll go with another cheap vendor next year. Like, surely it'll be a little bit better, right? But no, it's more of the same. Another dumpster fire there. So Moving on to another scenario, I wanted to talk about company B here. So company B, just like company A, their regulators also require an annual penetration test. But the difference between company B and company A is that the bigwigs kind of understand the need for security. So there is a solid budget for the security testing, actually. So what this leads to is the company does a bunch of research and sends out, a few RFPs to, a few vendors that have good track records, and they're able to set up, those scope calls, those initial meetings, to kind of pick the vendor that works for them. The issue is that there's, surprisingly very few vendors to choose from that are going to provide, a good penetration test, and as well as, actually provide a penetration test, for certain types of prices. So they eventually pick one that makes sense for them, after a bunch of vetting processes, as well as, a lot of discussions with the vendor. And how does that work out? Well, it turns out a lot better for them, dancing there as a baby versus being in a dumpster fire. So what's the difference between the types of reports you get from a real penetration test, and a real penetration test vendor versus those who are just providing you kind of the bare minimum and or just a vulnerability scan? So option A here is that you always get validated, useful information. And kind of what that means is that all the findings in there have actually been tested. So you can see within the report itself, that there is actually reasons the vulnerabilities in there. The penetration tester actively exploited them and showed that, hey, we could, access your domain with this vulnerability or get user credentials, something like that. Same with approved risks. That kind of shows, why this is actually a vulnerability and what's it matter. It can help the company make good decisions for budgeting because they'll actually understand the issues in their environment, in a clear, concise manner. They won't just have that big spreadsheet of vulnerabilities. They'll actually have, pointed recommendations and pointed findings that can help them kind of increase their security. And then it builds confidence in the company's people, because their managers and the people who hired us to do the penetration testing can see that the IT security team is working hard to remediate issues that pop up in the environment. And then lastly, the thing that always comes with a good penetration testing report is that you'll kind of get a better idea of what the actual vulnerabilities are that aren't so cut or dry. So for example, if you just run a vulnerability scan, with Tenable Nessus or something like that, and just, give a client all the highs and criticals, that's good and all. But there's some like an informational, like SMB v1 or SMB signing, LMNR, stuff like that, that can be abused on penetration tests to gain access to domains or escalate privileges that, wouldn't immediately be called out in a vulnerability scan. So that's another good thing about getting a penetration test from a company that, actually is providing a penetration test and not just a vulnerability scan, is the tester is going to understand, why certain things are vulnerabilities. And, it's not just based on CVSS rating or stuff like that. It's how they can be kind of trained and exploited there. In option B, there really is no option B, because that's the type of report you're going to be getting. So now company B, unlike company A, has a solid point of reference for when performing security testing going forward. This can help because if they want to choose a new vendor, if they just want to move on from the one that they got a penetration test with before, they'll actually understand, what they're supposed to be getting, and they can, make more informed decisions when it comes to picking partners for penetration tests. Same with the fact that a team's brought in. What that kind of means is a good penetration testing firm will always support their reports out, and they won't charge you like extra hours for it. So for example, if we have a finding, send that to a client, and they have information that they want to know, about the finding or 3 weeks out from the finalized report date, they can always give us a call and we'll answer that. And, we won't charge them any extra to help them, with that issue. We won't help them actually implement the control because that could lead to conflict of interest, but we'll help them get, to a good point of understanding what they need to do to remediate the issue. And then obviously, if you get a good penetration test, there's always less likelihood of a nastier breach that's going to be happening. Cool. So what are the takeaways for some of our clients? So the takeaways here specifically are: do not always shop for the lowest cost provider. While it could, while it looks nice and it would be great if the lowest cost provider was always the one that provided the best testing, that's not always the case. So you want to make sure you're not going with the lowest cost provider, because most likely they're not going to be the one that provides you the best services. Takeaway number 2, always look into the vendors you're considering. You don't want to just go in blind. You want to make sure, they have a good track record, and they're not just, a new company that's showing up on the scene and you're like, oh, they're offering a $100 penetration tests, let's go with them. You want to make sure you vetted them and you kind of understand what they're going to be doing for you. Always ask for references from your vendors. So if you want to, hire somebody for a penetration test, they should always have references from clients they've done work with in the past that can help them, provide a good example to prospective clients about what they're going to be getting, and provide, good recommendations. They're kind of like a work recommendation, if you will. And then obviously you want to pay attention to the communication when you're talking to the vendor who's going to do a penetration test for you. Some of the important questions are they asking about your environment? Because you don't want a penetration tester to just show up and not understand your environment. For example, they want to ask, are you using Windows machines, Mac machines? Do you have how many servers you have? Is it all in the cloud? Stuff like that. That's all important questions that the vendor should be asking to get a sense of your environment for the type of penetration test that needs to be performed. Another question that should always be asked or be spoken about is their processes. So we always go through with our clients, in our pre-scope calls and things like that, what we're going to do on each penetration test and how it's going to be performed. So the client's aware of the goals, what type of tools we're going to use, everything like that, just so you're aware of what's going to be happening. Because you don't want a penetration tester to show up and just run mass scan on your network and, just call it a day like that, and you expected more. You don't really want that to happen. So always asking about their processes is important. The next part is when you were given when you're talking to the vendor, you want to know who's performing the work. So for example, do they have BIOS for their employees, or are they kind of contracting the work out? A lot of the times, some CPA firms will say they do penetration testing, but the work's been 1099 out. And if you're not familiar with that is, it means the work's kind of been contracted out to, not full-time employees of the CPA firm. So they'll just hire those employees or contract them out when needed to perform penetration testing. So it's not full-time employees of the vendor that's performing the penetration test. So you always want to be aware of that when talking to the vendor about who's going to be performing the work. Some more takeaways to touch on some of the questions that we've gotten from clients when we're delivering reports there, but we let you in. As we kind of talked about, the processes from a good vendor should always be explained of how the penetration testing is going to be performed. So in the scenario of an assumed breach, which is what we always do, we always let our clients know upfront that, hey, if we don't get access to your domain after a day or so, we're going to ask for a user account from you. Because there's no point of just bashing our head against the wall. If they have like a NAT control in place that's stopping us or something like that, it's much better and more valuable for the client if we're gonna ask for that access, so we can then test for that from that user perspective, so we can get a more overall view of what's going on in their environment. And I can promise you there's most likely going to be something vulnerability wise once we get a user account. So that's why it's always important to understand that while you did let us in, it is a realistic scenario for an attacker to land a phish on a user's computer and then establish a C2 on their system, which would then give them kind of access like they're in the network, which is what we kind of do our penetration testing from. The second question is, that's not a realistic scenario. And it's probably true if it was just a vulnerability scan that was ran in the past. If you had a bad vendor in the past, it's not going to be a realistic scenario of just running a scan and calling and just poking at what they can and calling it a day. It's much more free form, and like I said, an attacker can always land a phish and get access to the network that way. So that's realistic in that sense. Our MSSP would have stopped you. In this case, the question is always, did you tell them we were coming? If not, why didn't they stop us? A lot of the times on our penetration tests, we'll just have the client alert on a NAC that our device was connected, and then the only other alert they get throughout testing is like when we try to dump LSAS memory or something like that from CrowdStrike or whatever EDR they have in place. But other than that, it's fairly silent. So it's making sure you understand what your MSP is supposed to be doing, and having a conversation with them about like, hey, this penetration test is going on. Can you let us know like what alerts would have come from that or something like that? So yeah, it's about having a conversation with your MSP, understanding what type of alerts they should be generating, stuff like that, when they don't stop us. The next is this report doesn't adequately reflect our environment. And this kind of comes back to, the questions that a good vendor will be asking. They'll be asking about your environment, making sure they understand the controls you have in place, if there's like any compensating controls for any of the findings. And a good vendor should always also be checking in throughout the testing, sending status updates to make sure you're on the same page with the findings. So there's not any of those weird questions along the way. It's like, hey, we have this tracked or something like that. Why is this coming up? And you can talk through that with them. Yeah, kind of like what I was just talking about with the tracking the issues. The status meetings should be happening fairly regularly, weekly, depending on the frequency, or daily for that. So that should be a good way to avoid that issue as well. A good penetration testing firm will always be providing those status meetings as well as daily status updates. And then when it comes to our report was clean last year, a good way to answer this is possibly because you're company A, maybe you went with a cheaper penetration testing firm last year, or one that doesn't really perform penetration testing. So you didn't get a full penetration test. That's what we see a lot of the times for that one. Why didn't the previous vendor find this? And this is a really tough question to answer. But a lot of the times it comes down to, did they have a scope call with you? Did they tell you about their process? Stuff like that. We can ask about it and kind of try to get to the root cause, but a lot of the times we're not ultimately going to know why it wasn't found by the previous tester, just because we weren't there doing the testing and we weren't in the environment at the time. So that's always a tough question to answer, but generally it's because you went with a penetration testing firm that didn't do it fully. So some more takeaways. What can you ask the vendor to help you kind of get to the bottom of whether they're going to provide you with a good penetration test or not? The first question here you can always ask is, do you perform a vulnerability scan during the penetration test? And if so, what is it used for? This will easily help you avoid that situation where all they do is run a tenable scan on your network and try and poke at the vulnerabilities and call it a day. If that's not a penetration test, and that's really what you want to avoid. So asking this will give you a good understanding if that's what they're trying to do. Do you attempt exploitation of vulnerabilities found? Kind of going back to running that tenable scan. Are they doing that? And are they just like, looking at the vulnerabilities and giving them to you? Are they trying to exploit them? If not, they really should be, to making sure they're valid, because there could be a lot of false positives in vulnerability scans. So it's making sure, the penetration tester you're bringing in is actually going to attempt to exploit the vulnerabilities that they find to make sure they're valid. The next question you can always ask is, how much of a focus of testing is on, Active Directory or identity testing? And this is important because that's really where the focus is in terms of, just threat actors in general. It's phishing, it's, credential attacks, stuff like that. It's not, it's not exploiting like zero-day vulnerabilities, stuff like that. A lot of the times it's just, weak credentials or weak configurations within Active Directory that can easily be abused. So you want to make sure to ask that question if you do have Active Directory to make sure that's covered in their testing as well. The next thing is you can always ask for a sample report. Any reputable vendor, penetration test vendor, should be able to give you a sample report that gives you a good idea of what their breakdown looks like, what their findings look like, and what type of testing you can generally expect from them. And then kind of what we were talking about before when it comes to you want to know who's doing the penetration testing. It's like, are your testers actually employees or are they contracted out? Because if they're contracted out, it's generally not going to be as thorough of a penetration test as if they're an in-house unit or that's part of the company's full-time service offering. So you always want to make sure that those employees are full-time employees and the work's not just being contracted out to some other person to get it done. And then you always want to ask what kind of training folks are doing in terms of penetration testing. So penetration testing is always an evolving game. Security is an evolving game. I'm sure, as you all know, it's constantly changing, month by month, day by day. So you want to make sure the folks that are doing the training are doing the testing are always getting trained on a regular basis, and the training is kind of relevant to what they're doing. So any firm should be able to provide you, or any vendor doing penetration testing should be able to provide you a good idea of some of the resources their testers are using to stay trained and up to date. And finally, a big important one, if you're going to include social engineering, is you always want to ask what their phishing process is going to look like. Because a lot of the times we see that testing is just based on, or phishing testing is just based on clicks and entering cred metrics, which is good to track. But what our phishing process really focuses on is kind of those advanced metrics. So for example, if Susie received a phishing email, she clicked on the link and she entered her credentials, but she realized her mistake, a minute later and reported it to IT. And there's a good process for IT to follow to make sure, their passwords get changed, everything like that. Then that's not as big of a deal as if, there wasn't that process in place. So you always want to make sure their phishing isn't just purely focused on who clicked, who entered credentials, because that's kind of a shallow look at it. You want to look at it more in depth there to make sure you're getting, a real bang for your buck there when it comes to the social engineering testing. And it's not just that, oh, we sent an email and this many people clicked on a link, you should reprimand them, because that's not really the point of it in the issue there. So yeah, that's it. Any questions?
Man, I know Tammy Santolo in the chat a while back asked the question, do you perform retesting after remediation? What's your perspective there?
Yeah, so we definitely do perform remediation testing. We offer it as a separate service, or it can be built in as part of our penetration testing offering, where we'll say we'll do the penetration test, and then we'll come in, a month later, 2 months later, 3 months later, whatever the client wants to come in and retest those issues, let them know if we're still seeing them, and work with them to get that stuff fixed up. So yes, we do perform retesting after remediation, if that's what the client wants.
As a follow-up to that, Matt, because I know I've received that question as well. Typically, what would you recommend in terms of the time period post remediation has been declared to do that testing? Is it right away? Is there maybe some lag to ensure that controls and configurations continue to operate? What would you recommend to folks who are in that situation?
Yeah, obviously it depends on what the findings were. Sometimes it can just be, turn on a setting, turn one off, and that's all it is. Sometimes it can be a much bigger undertaking of, talking to vendors, seeing why certain things are configured certain ways. So it's always important to talk with the client about that. But I'd say generally a few months, 3 to 6 months, depending on how many, how many issues or how deep the issues are. But 6 months, yeah, I'd say 3 to 6 months if there's not that many issues, and then 6 months to a year depending on if there's a lot of critical issues there.
Fair, and Tammy chimed in with something similar. Thank you, Tammy. That remediation can sometimes take 6 months, right? Depending on what type systems are impacted based upon their complexity. All right. Any other questions, folks? Feel free to either use the chat function or the Q&A function here in Zoom. I guess as we maybe wait for some additional questions, Matt, any other takeaways you would summarize for the folks here? I know you had really good slides that talked about specific takeaways based upon the scenarios. And Byron, to your question, we will provide the slides along with a recording of this webcast posted to the Wolf and Company YouTube page. But Matt, anything else you would want these folks to have as a true takeaway based upon the subject and details you talked about today?
Yeah, I'd say the true takeaway is just ask questions when you're trying to get a penetration test from the vendor. Like, make sure you understand what's going on and make sure you understand like what a penetration test is itself. Like, a penetration test, like I was saying, is not just a vulnerability scan and that's it. Like, you want to make sure they're doing more than just a vulnerability scan and they're actively trying to exploit the vulnerabilities. And that can easily be figured out by just asking the vendor questions, when you're sending RFPs or having those initial scope calls, anything like that. That's a really good time. And a really important thing is just to understand like what they're going to be doing. So I'd say the biggest takeaway is just ask questions to the vendor when it comes to a penetration test.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. I'm not seeing any other questions or comments here in the chat box, but as I recap here, maybe if there's any last minute questions for you folks to send through. Otherwise, like I mentioned, the recording and the PowerPoint slides will be sent at some point in the future from ISACA. I've been keeping track of attendance from different folks to ensure that the CPA credits make their way through. But other than that, if there's no other questions, I really appreciate everyone's time and attendance here today. Matt, thank you so much for going through these different scenarios with real life takeaways. And I hope you folks at your organizations are able to have some lessons learned here and not find yourself in the middle of any of these example scenarios that we sent through. Otherwise, thank you again for your time and good luck out there. Take care, everyone.